Pleasant and good afternoon to everyone. So normally in these chapters, we go back to the previous chapter and recap what happened there. Actually, with this account, we need to go back to the 25th chapter because that's where, early in that chapter, where Paul appeals to Caesar. Through the rest of that chapter, in the 25th chapter, it's Paul's defense before Agrippa, and then he continues that same defense in chapter 26. So the problem, you could say, with appealing to Caesar is the distance. When you're in Caesarea or close to Jerusalem. We'll bring up a map in a little bit, but as far as I could tell, it's something like 1,300 miles, 1,200 miles by the route that they're going to eventually take. And of course, in that day and age, that was quite a boat ride in the best of times, and the account tonight is not going to be the best of times. One thing I love about the Bible is, we have so many lessons recorded and so many discourses from, various ones, but we also we have these firsthand accounts of how these men acted in extremely difficult situations. And, that really tells what a person's made out of whenever you're in trouble, whenever things aren't going well. In the situation tonight, Paul's going to be on a boat and terrible storm, and the storm lasts, I'm sure it seemed like forever, but by it lasted 14 days, which I don't know of a storm, that's lasted 14 days. So this thing was just incredible. But Paul's, so just backing up a minute, Paul, he's been falsely accused again and again, and, things that aren't true at all. He's not getting any justice. Months and years are going by, I think 2 years, before he finally departs from Caesarea to go to Rome, that he's in captivity there, Caesarea. And so it's got to be frustrating. Most people would complain, and, the Lord had told him earlier in the book of Acts that he wanted him to go before kings and he wanted him to go before Caesar, but that does not seem to be happening very quick. This is an interesting thing. Sometimes we think about it would have been really awesome to have been able to speak with God and have angels appear to you like some did in the Bible, and as happens in this account. But the thing about all those men is angels would speak to them and promises would be given, and it sometimes took years. In this case, it's going to take a couple of weeks before we see the deliverance. So, of course, in Abraham's case, it took a very long time. But tonight's a story about faith. I mean, you could take many things from this, but Paul, throughout this horrible time of trial, he keeps the faith. He never complains. In fact, he's an inspiration to those around him. So, just to get a kind of an overview, in the bottom right-hand corner is Judea and Jerusalem, Caesarea, where he's going to start his journey. And in the upper left-hand corner is Rome, and of course, Italy and that whole area. And they would have normally taken a more direct route, but due to weather problems, they wound up taking a pretty circuitous route. So beginning in the first verse, and when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. So that was their intent. They wanted to stay close to the shore. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. So it says we put to sea. So what does he mean by we? He goes ahead and mentions Aristarchus, who is first mentioned over in Acts 19 during that riot with Demetrius and the metal workers and where their trade, the idols they were making, their trade was impinged on, and they caused a riot. So that was where we first met him, and he was one of the ones that got caught up in that and was punished. Of course, the other one is Luke, who is the writer of this account. So that's pretty awesome whenever you have the writer of an account. You talk about firsthand. I mean, he rowed the boat. He was there. Meaning to sail along the coast, so they wanted to take, it was getting late in the year. As we'll see later, it was, I think, middle of September to 1st of October, and it was getting late, and you know, the time of year when weather was normally bad, and so their best chances was to stay close to the coast, in this case, the coast of Asia. The other thing that it's interesting that it mentioned is that Julius treated Paul kindly. And so, you know, Julius is a centurion. He's a Roman leader, got at least 100 men under him. He's a military leader. And, you know, this isn't the first time that we've seen a centurion who has been kind. Just a few chapters ago, it was Paul's nephew was brought before the centurion, you know, telling about the conspiracy they had to kill Paul, lay in wait and kill him. But the centurion was really kind to Paul's nephew. And we've got some other accounts as well. And I'm impressed that, so sometimes you run into people in the world who are just really wonderful people, and people who you will not expect a military leader in ancient Rome to be a very kind person, but he may have heard of Paul. You know, the word travels fast, and when he was handed over, he may have heard that this guy is not guilty, and it's trumped up charges, and you know all that. Who knows? It does not say, but it is notable that he was kind, and that's really meaningful, and it was recorded so that we would notice it. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary, or going the wrong direction. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia, where the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. So just to kind of refresh ourselves on what's happening here, we'll go back to the map, and I drew in a couple of blue arrows, and the one at the bottom, so the wind was kind of out of the, as best I can tell, it must have been, from commentaries that I read, it must have been out of the southwest at this point, because they detoured around this island. They normally would have went in this direction, but they detoured so that the island was on their left as they went around it. And that way the island shielded them from the wind, which was coming out of the south-southwest. And as they continue on across, we're going to see that when they get over into this area, the wind apparently changes, or the wind's blowing in a different direction over there. And so then they wind up detouring in this direction, whereas they normally would have taken a much more direct route. So the winds are a very big issue. And of course, remembering this is a sailboat. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, and Paul advised them, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." So when he said the fast was already over, from what I read in the commentaries, that meant somewhere in late September, specifically that year, somewhere between September 24th and October the 1st, depending on which fast that he was talking about. Saying, "Men, I perceive this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only the cargo and ship, but also our lives." So Paul had a lot of experience with sailing ships. He had made a number of trips prior to this. We know that he had made trips through these areas with his missionary journeys, but also in 2 Corinthians 11:25, where he recounts to the Corinthians all the afflictions that he had been through. He said, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned, 3 times I was shipwrecked, a night and a day I've been in the deep. So to my knowledge, this account tonight is the only one that's recorded for us of those shipwrecks. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there may be, this is definitely, if the others are recorded, there is not the detail given that this one is. But bottom line is, Paul was experienced, even though he wasn't a sailor. Well, actually, I guess he was a fisherman. Well, maybe, I'm not sure. Anyway, Paul had experience with sailing and ships, and so because of the time of the year, this is probably why he said that this is not going to go well, and why he gave him this warning. Some commentators say, this could have been inspired by God, but most agree that probably not. This was probably just based on Paul's experience with the weather and everything. In verse 11, nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. So this is interesting. Paul gave some advice. It turned out to be really great advice, but they didn't listen. So what does Paul do? Well, as far as we know, he did nothing. He said nothing. He didn't have sour grapes. He wasn't angry. He didn't try to get back at him in any way. Just little tidbits, but such a good example. When the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon. So there's, first off, it was a tempestuous headwind, and so that's how we know again that it was a headwind, and it said it was a south wind. Well, first it was a south wind soft, and then as they put out, they had a tempestuous headwind arose. So it changed directions a little bit, as we saw on the map earlier, and they give it this name, and this word doesn't appear anywhere else in the New Testament, and there's been a lot of supposition as to where it came from or what it means, but the most probable supposition is that it denotes a wind not blowing steadily from any quarter, but a hurricane or a wind veering about to different quarters. So we don't know for sure, but that would help explain why it took so long for them to get through this. And then in the last part there, verse 15, it says, well, so when the ship was caught in the wind and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. So they basically dropped the sails, tied the rudders, and let the ship go. At that point, they didn't try to control it. So they let her drive before the wind. They let the wind take the ship because they knew that they, with that antiquity, that kind of a vessel in that kind of a storm, they knew from experience that if they tried to drive it themselves, then it was going to tear it up. So now we're over in this area, and if this was a hurricane, then that would explain a lot of things, because it took a long time to cross, and it also, would explain the difference in direction and everything. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. And the skiff they're talking about is going to come into the story later. This is the lifeboat. And apparently, up until that point, they had been maybe towing it along. But it says they secured it, in verse 17, when they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail, and so were driven. Well, so here it tells us they struck sail. So it means they lowered the sails. I just have to stop for a second on verse 17 on the physical difficulties of undergirding the ship with cables in the middle of a storm. That had to be a challenge, to say the least. As I've mentioned before, the Bible is so understated, and it's given us a lot of details in this story, this account, that we normally don't have. But what a nightmare. I mean, and this is just the beginning of it. Yeah, it says, because we were exceedingly tempest tossed. The Bible is not really, doesn't use a lot of adjectives like this. And when it does, it really means something. So the sands of, can't even read it without my glasses, sands of Sirta. So they were so lost. We think they were probably up here somewhere, but they were worried that they were going to come crashing down all the way down here, hundreds of miles, So down here on the bottom, that's 300 miles. So they were worried they were going to be, 400 miles off course and wind up hitting Sirte. And later it's going to tell us that, for many days they couldn't see the sun, they couldn't see the stars, so they were absolutely lost. I mean, their compasses, they couldn't do dead reckoning, they couldn't navigate because they couldn't see the sun, they couldn't see the stars, so they were just lost. And so they were really concerned. It also mentions that they lightened the ship. The heavier, the heavier the load, the lower it rides in the water, and the more danger. And this is a big ship. Later, it's going to tell us how many people. I think it was 276, plus a cargo of wheat. Not sure if you can see the picture I found on the internet very well of a medieval ship with the sails down, tossed, and lightning and rain. I mean, there really are no words to describe, I mean, the person having been there, could have described it. But as far as me describing it or to put it in words is really difficult. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So at this point, it's not just the crew that's doing things. It says we threw the ship's tackle. So they got rid of everything that wasn't needed, everything that, any kind of furniture, just get rid of everything, lighten the ship. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. And in verse 27, it's going to say that it's going to mention the 14 days, and this is probably most of those 14 days. And so if you can imagine adrift out of the sea in the middle of a hurricane, lost, not knowing where you're at. And so that's why it says when all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. They were tough. They hung in there, but after a period of time, and they were thinking by natural causes. Is there any way we're going to pull this out and save ourselves? And they finally basically said, we've had it. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss." So he does remind them gently of what had happened. In his situation, some would have been a little more forceful maybe, but he needs to get their attention and have them remember, because he's got some news to deliver here, but he's going to need their cooperation. Now, verse 22, "And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you.'" You notice it says God has granted. So that means Paul asked. He asked for the whole crew. He wasn't just worried about him and his travelers, the other two guys that were with him, but he He asks for all of them. And the angel says, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So again, just a window into Paul's attitude, always thinking about others, always selfless, never vindictive. In verse 25, therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. I believe God. And that was Paul's way of life. In the middle of a storm with no help in sight, God had promised him, that he would go before Caesar. At this point, it's looking pretty improbable, at least from a man's standpoint, and Paul was human. Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, I had to laugh just a little bit because that's probably how it seemed. I mean, he didn't say in a circle, but, back and forth. And, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. Well, so this is interesting. It's midnight, and yet the sailors sensed that they were drawing near land. Well, of course, the only way they could have known that is by hearing the surf. There's no other way. It's night. It's not like they had some sixth sense about them, where they could feel where the land was. No, they heard the surf. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, which is about 120 feet, and which is shallow. The ocean in that part of the world is very deep. And when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. So it was getting shallower pretty quick. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. So, they wanted to be able to see what was coming. I could hear it. So I couldn't, of course, find a great picture of a reef, a rocky reef. And it says they were getting blown back and forth. So what I'm envisioning is it was more of a rocky reef, kind of like out in the background here. And it probably went for some distance. And, all of you that have been to the ocean and been near the surf, and especially in places, where they surf and everything, it's loud. And you can hear it for a long ways. Well, that was a red flag for the sailors, and rightfully so. And they certainly took note and noticed what they did. They were not exactly heroic. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, so that's not a good thing, is it? When the pilots, when the sailors, the ones driving this boat, all they can think about is getting on the lifeboat and getting out, taking their chances on the lifeboat. When they had let down the skiff into the sea under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurions and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Well, they needed the expertise of the sailors. They needed to be able to steer this thing into the right. It was like, threading a needle in a haystack. They were threading a needle. They're going to have to put it in just the right place to miss those rocks. This time the soldiers listened to him. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. One thing to just note here, there's a lot of spiritual applications they need to stay on the ship, you know. So Jesus saves us if we stay in the church. But, you know, if we're, say we get baptized and we become a member of the church and we're in the kingdom, if we jump off, then we're not saved. You know, if they jumped off the ship, then there was no salvation for them. Another thing is, even though Paul had been promised that he would stand before Caesar, notice that he didn't just stop doing anything. He continues to do everything in his power. So we have promises that are given to us. And, you know, we need to do everything in our power to do what's right and to obey the commandments and use doctors, use everything we can. And the grace of God can take up where we fail, where we can't go any further. And that's exactly what happened here. But it was very important to keep trying. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Notice that he took bread and gave thanks. I mean, they're still in a dire predicament. In fact, it's like, you know, the proverbial dark before the dawn. I mean, it's the darkest hour. But yet, he's already giving thanks. And he did this in the presence of all of them. And that inspired them. They were encouraged. They were probably scared to death before that. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile loosening the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. So they were way off course. You know, these were experienced sailors. They didn't know where they were. They didn't recognize it. But they did see a beach, a bay with a beach, which is what they needed. You know, some kind of a sandy beach, anything but rocks. And notice the sequence that happens in verse 40. They let go the anchors. They loosed the rudder ropes. So that's how I'm pretty sure they had the rudder tied up until then, and they hoisted the mainsail. But striking a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So they went for it, you know, mainsail up. They took aim and they ran it aground, and they did apparently just the right place. It doesn't mention any rocks. But of course, the front of the boat stuck, and the waves and the wind and everything, the storm broke it in half and tore it up. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners lest any of them should swim away and escape. Of course, that was typical of Roman soldiers. You know, anytime they had prisoners, if they lost any prisoners, it was their life was taken. But the centurion overrode that. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, So it was a ways, and the rest, and some on boards and some on parts of the ship. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. So what are the odds of all escaping safely to land? Of course, the Lord kept his word. It was a miracle. And, hopefully they saw that. Hopefully they understood. Those are my comments. I'll open it up for any comments. No questions.
Enjoyed your covering the chapter tonight, Larry. A couple of things I mentioned that stood out to me in this chapter. One was I always envisioned that being a fairly small boat because of the age in which it was, but they actually had pretty good sized vessels, and we see that had to be the case because of the 276 people on it. But the commentators I read after said that this boat was about 36 feet wide for this type of boat and about 140, 150 feet long. And so if you want to imagine us in that tonight, that's about the width of this building and about 1.5 times the length. Now, if you can imagine being in something about 1.5 times the size of this building for 14 days with 276 people, you start to get a feeling for kind of what they were going through on this. The other thing, just kind of a spiritual point that stood out to me a lot in the chapter was around verse 25, and you mentioned this about Paul living by faith. But one of the things that really struck me this time when I studied this was the fact that the people listened to Paul because of his attitude from the beginning. He had told them what they should do, but they could see, I'm sure, by the manner of way he was living among them, and that he was right, that he had some credibility with them. And so instead of saying, see, you should have listened, to me, and I know it all, now you listen to me. Instead, he was like, okay, you should have listened to me because who I was listening to was God, and God has spoken to me, and he said we should do this. And if you will listen to God, and I believe God, and if you will believe him, basically, then he'll see us through this. So I just thought it was interesting because he gave God the credit. Mm-hmm. At first, they didn't really know, I guess, why he thought he knew so much. But after being with him for all this time, he declared, okay, you shouldn't listen to me, and here's why. Because I'm listening to God, and God has said this, and I believe it. And, if we share the gospel and the good news with people like that, they see our lives, hopefully, and they have confidence, well, must be doing something right, seem to be at peace, and, seem to know what's going on. And when we offer the gospel instead of, I've got all the answers, I know it all, y'all listen to me, it should be, well, I'm listening to God, and God said this, and I do it because I believe it. And then it gives them the free will choice of, well, I think maybe I will investigate that and believe that too. And we're not just a know-it-all, you should do this, and if you don't, you're just not as smart as I am or something. Because it wasn't about Paul being smart, it was about Paul being informed and Paul having faith, belief, as you mentioned. So I just thought that.
I appreciate that, and I agree with 100%. I mean, time and time again, we see in the scriptures great men of faith, but they always gave God the credit. Again and again, they would reveal the source of their great strength. And that was that's a good point. Thank you.
I loved your lesson. That was wonderful. Acts 27 is such in a way, joy to read, to see how God is exalted, even amidst these great 14-day storms, and had everybody scared to death except for Paul. He seemed pretty calm about it all. And I love his phrase, David mentioned it, I believe God. And then when he got ready to eat, finally, he said, let's everybody eat. Then he gave thanks to God. He always gave thanks to God. And that is a lesson for us all to learn. And you made that point abundantly clear. And I sincerely appreciate it. But it was a wonderful job. And this is a great chapter. It's been a good story to read to your kids sometimes. Just let them know this is God. God took care of these people.
I wish somebody would make a movie, of this, because with some of the tools and everything they have now, they could really do a good job with it. Anybody else?
I appreciate the lesson and everything. As you starting out there and such, this is my speculation. Okay, it's all in my head. But the Caesarea, what we don't realize about ancient Caesarea is that it was the largest man-made harbor in ancient times. It was literally an engineering marvel. It could host dozens and dozens of ships. It had warehouses, it had shops, it had, in fact, the palace overlooked the harbor. And such. Caesarea was an amphitheater. It had the circus, it had all kinds of stuff. But the harbor itself was an amazing thing, and the historians would tell you that more produce, more stuff passed through that harbor than any other harbor in the ancient world. And the years that Paul was kept in the palace, I just wondered how many times he looked out and saw the harbor there and was wondering, when am I ever going to go? And then when he finally does,
Yeah, good point. I love those kind of details. It's really interesting. Just, to be able to do the things they did back then is so amazing, considering the tools and everything they had. Anybody else? If there's no one else, we'd ask that everyone, if there's anyone that would like to become a member of the church, I think probably all are, but if you would, we would be happy to assist you in that. Or if there's one who has drifted away and would like to prayers the church, in either case, we'd ask that you come as we stand and say.